Some days fold into the others and you forget them by supper. And then there are the days that don't let go. The days that sit in your chest like a stone you carry to your grave, polished smooth from how often you turn it over. I've buried friends. I've buried a wife. But the day I'm about to tell you about is the one I think of most, and I still don't fully understand why. Maybe by the end of telling it I will. Maybe you'll understand it before I do. Either way, sit down. Pour yourself something. This one took me 40 years to be able to say out loud. I had $9 in my coat and a list in my wife's handwriting, and that's the whole reason I was in town that morning. Coffee, flour, a spool of black thread, liniment for the bay mare's swollen hock, nails, the long kind, 2 pounds, and written smaller at the bottom like she was embarrassed to ask, a little something sweet if there's money left, you old goat. That last line had her loop on the G that I'd been looking at across kitchen tables for 19 years. I folded the list and put it back in my breast pocket, the way you put away a photograph. I'll tell you my one peculiarity right off so you'll know the kind of man you're riding with. I keep a tally book, always have. Little leather thing fits in a palm and I write down what the day spends and what it earns. Rain in inches. Calves dropped. The price of feed. My father did it before me and called it keeping honest with God, though I think he just liked the feeling of accounting for himself, of proving he'd been somewhere and done something and it could be read back later in ink. I do it for the same reason, probably. A man wants evidence he was here. So you understand, that morning my plan was small. Buy 6 things, tally them, ride home before the heat came down off the rocks like a hand pressed flat on the back of your neck. The town was called Cedar Wash, though there hadn't been a cedar in living memory, and the wash only ran 3 weeks out of the year. It was the kind of town that was mostly one street with ambitions. A bank that doubled as a notary, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a row of false front buildings standing up straight and proud and lying about how big they were behind. And down at the end where the boardwalk gave up and turned to dirt, Hutchins' General Store, and 2 doors down, the cafe that Verna Pell ran with her husband's name still on the window, though her husband had been 3 years dead. It was hot already. 8 in the morning and the dogs had given up on the street and crawled under the porches. I tied my horse, a gray gelding named Patience, who had none, to the rail outside Hutchins, and I just got my boot up on the step when I heard the bell over the cafe door, 2 doors down, ring sharp and quick. Then a voice. Verna's voice raised, the way a voice rises when it wants the whole street to hear it being righteous. We don't serve your kind, you know that, you've been told. I didn't turn right away. I want to be honest with you about that. The first thing I did was not turn. I stood with my boot on the step and my mind already in Hutchins counting nails, and there was a part of me, the part I am least proud of, the part I have spent 40 years trying to outrun, that thought, not my business, old man. Get your flour. But the voice came again, and this time it was lower and it wasn't Verna's. It was a woman's but quiet, and it had something in it I couldn't name at first. Not begging. That's what stopped me. If she'd been begging, I might have gone on inside, ashamed but moving. She wasn't begging. She said, I have money. I'm asking to buy food, that is all. And there was a dignity in it so plain, and so unbothered by Verna's noise, that it turned me around on the step like a hand on my shoulder. She was standing on the boardwalk outside the cafe, half in the sun. An Apache woman, older than me by maybe a decade, though it's hard to say. Her face was the kind of face the desert makes, where age stops being a number and becomes a kind of geology. She wore a dress that had been good once and had been kept good through what must have been an enormous amount of care. You could see where it had been mended at the cuff with thread that almost matched but didn't quite. Her hair was iron and silver, pulled back. She had a cloth bag over one shoulder, and she was holding out her hand, not reaching, just holding it open, palm up, and in it were coins. American coins. I could see the dull shine of them from where I stood. Verna was filling the doorway with her arms crossed. Behind her, through the window, I could see 2 of the cafe's 3 tables occupied. Old Prout, who ran the livery, and a pair of men I half knew, surveyors maybe, passing through. All of them watching. none of them eating. The whole little room hung there waiting to see what the morning would decide about itself. "I don't care if you got the King of England's gold," Verna said. "You can't sit at my tables. Now go on before I get Sheriff Doyle." The woman lowered her hand, slowly. "Not in defeat, I want to be precise about this because it matters, but the way you'd lower a flag you intended to raise again." She put the coins back into a small pouch at her waist with a care that I found unbearable to watch. She was being careful with her money in front of a woman who just told her it was worthless to her. That carefulness did something to me. I felt it behind my sternum like a swallowed stone. "I should tell you something about myself here, so you don't think I was a hero. I was not. I was a 51-year-old rancher who'd been raised in that country by people who'd fought that woman's people, and who'd absorbed without ever once examining it the idea that there was a natural order to the street I was standing on, and that she was at the bottom of it, and I was somewhere in the comfortable middle, and Verna Pell at the top by virtue of owning the only cafe for 40 miles. I had never in my life questioned any of this out loud. I'd watched things like this happen before, not often, because they mostly didn't come into town, and when they did they knew better, and I'd looked away, the way you look away from a thing your town has agreed not to see. So when I tell you I crossed those 2 doors of boardwalk and stopped beside her, I'm not telling you I'd planned it, or that I was a good man, or that I'd had some flash of conscience that lit me up righteous. I'm telling you I moved before I knew I was moving, and that my heart was going like a rabbit's, and that the loudest voice in my head the whole way was the cowardly one saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing, you fool?" I took off my hat. I don't know why I did that first. Habit maybe, a man takes off his hat for a woman, but I think now it was something more. I think taking off my hat in front of an Apache woman on the boardwalk of Cedar Wash was, in the small grammar of that town, the first sentence of something I couldn't take back. "Morning," I said, to her, not to Verna. The woman looked at me. Her eyes were dark and very steady, and they held mine for a moment, and there was no warmth in them, and I didn't blame her for that. Why would there be? A white man had just removed his hat. In her life that had probably preceded nothing good, she didn't trust it. She was right not to. "Morning," she said back even. Verna shifted in the doorway. "Tom Aldous, you go on into Hutchins and mind your list." That she knew I had a list, that the whole town knew everybody's small business, should have shamed me back through the door. Instead, it did the opposite. It made me stubborn. I have always had a stubbornness in me that I mistook for years as a virtue, and have lately come to understand as just the same cowardice turned inside out, a refusal to back down dressed up as principle. But that morning, the stubbornness and the principle happened to point the same direction, and that's about as much as a man can ask of himself, I've found. That the two of them line up even once. "Verna," I said, and I put my hat back on, which I see now was its own small declaration, hat off for the woman, hat on for the fight. "This lady says she has money and wants to buy food." "This lady," Verna said, and put a curl on the word that I felt in my teeth, "knows she can't sit at my tables." "I didn't ask to sit at the table," the woman said quietly. "Not to me, not to Verna, to the street, to the morning. I asked to buy bread." And there it was. She hadn't even asked for the chair. She'd asked for bread to take away, and Verna had refused her the bread. I want to stop here a moment because 40 years on, this is the part I keep returning to in the tally book of my mind. Not the dramatic part that came later. This. The bread. She would have walked away with it. She would have eaten it somewhere we didn't have to look at her eating it. She'd made herself as small and as easy as a person can make themselves, asking only for what she could carry off out of sight, and even that was too much for the morning to allow. "How much is a loaf?" I said. Verna blinked. "What?" "A loaf of bread, from your kitchen, how much?" "Tom." "How much, Verna?" The two surveyors had stopped pretending to be anything but an audience. Prude at his table had gone still as a fence post. Verna's jaw worked. "A nickel," she said, "but I'm not." I had my tally book out already. I keep a stub of pencil tucked in the spine. I licked it bad habit, ruins the lead, and I wrote, in the column where I write the day's spending, in my father's slanted hand that I'd inherited along with the book, 1 loaf bread, 5 cents. And then I dug a nickel out of my coat, and I held it out to Verna, and I said, "Then I'm buying a loaf of bread. From your cafe, for myself. And what I do with my own bread on the public street after I've bought it is no business of yours, nor the sheriff's, nor God's." The street held its breath. I could hear, very clearly, a fly somewhere and Patience stamping at the rail, and the surveyor nearest the window setting down his cup with the smallest click against the saucer. Verna looked at the nickel, she looked at me, and I watched her do the arithmetic that people do in those moments, the arithmetic of how much a thing will cost her to refuse versus to allow. If she took my nickel and handed me a loaf, she hadn't served the woman. She'd served me. She could tell herself that. The whole town could tell themselves that. It was a coward's loophole, and I was offering it to her with both hands because I understood, even then, that you don't change a town by making it brave all at once. You change it by giving it a way to do the right thing while pretending it did the usual thing. She snatched the nickel. "Wait here," she said, and went back inside, and the screen door banged, and the whole street let its breath out at once. The woman beside me hadn't moved. I felt more than saw that she'd turned her head a few degrees toward me. When I looked, she was studying me the way you'd study a coyote that had walked up and laid down beside you instead of running, not gratitude, not yet, but a recalculation, a revising of something she'd thought she'd known. "You'll buy trouble," she said, very low, "only for me." "I've got $9, I said. "I can afford a little." I don't know where the joke came from. It surprised me as much as her. And something moved across her face, not a smile. She was too careful for that, too long past the age where you smile at strangers in towns that hate you, but a softening at the corner of the eyes, a recognition. "Oh," the face said. "One of those. A fool with a joke. And I'll tell you, after a lifetime of being a serious man, of keeping serious books, I have never in my life been so glad to be taken for a fool." Verna came back with the bread wrapped in brown paper, and she shoved it into my hands and didn't meet my eyes, and she said loud for the room, "There. Now you and your bread can both get off my porch." And she went back inside and stood behind her counter and stared at the wall, and the surveyors went back to their plates, and Prout got up and left without finishing his coffee and walked past me close and didn't say a word, but he looked at me and I knew the look. It said, "I'll remember this. The town will remember this." The town would. I knew it would. A man does not do a thing like that on the only street in 40 miles and have it forgotten by supper. I had spent 51 years being one of them, an Aldous, a name on the church roll and the bank's good list, a man whose handshake was worth something at the feed store. And I just spent a nickel buying a piece of bread that everyone watching understood was not for me. And in doing so, I'd written my name in a different column in the town's tally book, and there's no eraser for that kind of ink. I held the loaf out to the woman. She didn't take it. She looked at it wrapped in its brown paper, warm. I could feel the warmth of it through the paper. Verna's ovens never went cold, and she looked at me and she said, "I have my own money. I do not need yours." And here is where I nearly ruined everything, because the easy thing, the thing my pride wanted, was to say, "Take it, it's a gift. Let me do you this kindness." To make her grateful. To collect on the goodness I just performed for the whole street to see. That's the trap in a thing like this. You do the brave thing and then you want to be thanked for it, want it to mean what you've decided it means, and you'll force the gift on a person past the point of grace just to feel the warmth of being good. I caught myself. I don't know how. Maybe it was the way she'd lowered her own coins so carefully, like they had worth even when she'd been told they didn't. Maybe it was just luck. "It's not a gift," I said. "It's a trade. I bought bread I don't want because I'm too stubborn to let Verna Pell tell me what I can do with my own nickel. Now I'm stuck with a loaf and a long ride home and a wife who will ask where the money went. You'd be doing me a kindness taking it off my hands. And I held it out again. The street was empty now of everyone but us. The sun had climbed and the shade of the false fronts had pulled back to a thin line at our feet. And the woman looked at the bread and looked at me and reached out slow, the way she did everything, like a person who had learned that fast movements get you hurt, and took the loaf. And she held it against her, both arms, the way you'd hold something living. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was a person of exact accounts same as me, she added, "For the trade." "For the trade," I agreed. I should have left it there. By every measure I understand, that should have been the whole story, a small thing, a nickel's worth of decency, a loaf of bread changing hands on a hot morning in a town not worth the name. I could have tipped my hat and gone into Hutchins, and bought my flour and my nails and ridden home and written it all in the tally book, and let it be a thing I'd done once quietly, that no one would ever know but the two of us and a cafe full of witnesses who'd never speak of it again. But I didn't leave it there, because as she turned to go and I watched her turn, watched her settle the loaf into the cloth bag with the same care she'd given the coins, I saw her face go gray. Not pale, gray. The color a face goes when something underneath it has given way. She put her hand out and caught the porch rail, and the bag slipped, and the loaf in its brown paper tumbled to the boards, and she went down after it slow, folding, the way a building comes down when the fire's been at it long enough, all at once but somehow gently, almost politely, settling into the dust of Verna Pell's porch with one hand still gripping the rail and the other reaching, even then, even falling, for the bread. And I was already moving. Hat off, knees in the dirt, both hands going out to catch a woman whose name I did not even know. I realized in that instant I'd never asked, that I'd fought the whole town over bread for a stranger and never once asked her name. And the last clear thought I had before the morning turned into something else entirely was the most foolish thought a man ever had, and I've never forgiven myself for it, and I've never stopped being grateful for it either. Don't let the bread get dirty. I caught her before she hit the boards. She was lighter than she had any right to be, light as the loaf almost, and up close I could see what the street had hidden, the gray that wasn't just shock, the hollow under the cheek, the wrist in my hand thin as a green branch. This was a woman who had not eaten in some time, a woman who had walked into town with her good mended dress and her careful coins and asked, with all her dignity intact, for bread, not because she wanted it. A woman weighs more when she's gone limp. Anybody who's carried a sleeping child knows it, the way they pour into your arms, all the holding up gone out of them, so they're heavier asleep than awake though they haven't gained an ounce. She'd held herself up so straight for so long, I think, that when she let go of it, the let go itself had weight. I got an arm behind her shoulders and one under her knees, and I stood, and my own knees cracked like green wood in a fire, and somewhere off to my left, I heard the cafe screen door bang and Verna Pell's voice say, "Oh, for God's sake," in a tone I couldn't read, disgust or fear or something that didn't have a clean name yet. "She needs water," I said to Verna, to anyone, "and shade." "Not in here she doesn't." "I'd like to tell you," I said something fine and cutting back. The truth is I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, with this gray woman in my arms whose pulse I could feel against my forearm going light and fast as a moth at a lamp, and Verna looked back, and whatever she saw in my face made her step out of the doorway, not into the cafe but out onto the porch, into the trouble with me, which I think surprised her as much as it did me. "Bring her round back," Verna said. "There's a bench in the shade by the kitchen door, and there's a well." She said it fast and low, like a woman handing you something stolen. "But you tell anybody I let her in my kitchen, and I'll call you a liar to your face, Tom Aldous." "She's not going in your kitchen," I said. "She's going on your bench, in the shade, like a dog would get." I don't know why I said it that ugly. I think I wanted to hurt her. I think I wanted her to know exactly the size of the thing she'd done, that she'd send a starving woman off without a nickel loaf and then offer her, as a mercy, the same shade you'd give an animal. But the cruelty of it landed on Verna's face, and I watched it land, and I felt no better, none at all. And I have noticed that about being right, that it almost never warms you the way you expect it to. You'd think being in the right would be a fire to sit beside. Mostly, it's just a cold, clear place to stand alone. The bench behind the cafe was in real shade, the deep kind that the back of a building keeps even in July. I laid her down on it and went to the well, and there was a tin cup hung on a nail, dented, and I drew up the bucket and the water came up cold and smelling of stone, and I wet my bandana first and pressed it to her temples and her wrists the way I'd learned to do for men gone down in the heat at branding, and then I got a little water past her lips, a little at a time, and after a while, a long while, long enough that I'd started doing the foolish thing a man does. Talking to a person who can't hear him. Come on now, come on. You didn't fight that whole street for one loaf just to quit on me back here. Her eyes came open. They came open and found me, and for a second there was nothing in them but the animal fear of a person who wakes and doesn't know where they are or who's leaning over them. Then it cleared. She knew me, the fool with the bread. And I watched her do the thing I'd come to know she always did, which was take account of her situation before she said a single word, eyes flicking to the well, the bench, the back door, my hands, the cup, calculating, always calculating. A woman who'd survived by knowing exactly where she was and what each thing in reach could cost or save her. The bread, she said, first thing, of course it was. It's here, it's fine. Got a little dirt on the paper, that's all. I'd snatched it up off the porch boards before I carried her round. It was sitting beside her on the bench. She put her hand on it, flat, like you'd put a hand on a Bible to swear, and only then did the rest of her ease back down onto the wood. I am not sick, she said. I want you to know, I am not sick. I am only, and she stopped, and I watched her decide whether to say the word, and I watched her be too proud and too honest both at once, so that what she finally said was neither a lie nor the whole truth. It has been a hard season. I know it has, I said. You don't know, she said, not sharp, just true. And she was right, I didn't. Her name was Lozen. She told me that much after she'd drunk a second cup and eaten slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch, tearing the loaf into small pieces and eating each one complete before she'd tear the next. The eating of a person who has learned that to eat fast when you're starved is to lose it all back up again. She ate maybe a third of the loaf and then stopped, deliberate, and wrapped the rest back in its dirty paper, and I understood that the rest was not for her. The rest was going somewhere. I sat on the ground with my back against the well and my hat beside me, and I got out the tally book without quite deciding to, and I held it but I didn't write in it, and she watched me hold it. What is that? She said. A book I keep, what the day costs, what it brings in. I felt foolish saying it. My father did it, I do it, it's just a thing I do. She considered this. And what will you write for today? I looked at the page. The last thing on it was one loaf bread 5 cents in my own hand from a half hour ago that felt like another life. I didn't have an answer. What do you write? One woman near dead behind a cafe. One town turned against me. One nickel, the best I ever spent. There's no column for it. The book my father gave me had columns for grain and stock, and weather and money, and it had no column for the morning I was having. And I sat there with the pencil, and felt the whole inadequacy of having spent my life trying to keep an honest account of things that could be counted, while the things that mattered ran off the edges of the page. I don't know yet, I said. She nodded like that was the right answer. Like a wrong answer would have told her something bad about me, and the not knowing told her something good. Then she told me in pieces, with long silences between, and I'm going to tell it to you straighter than she told it to me, because she told it the way you tell a thing you've decided not to feel anymore, flat, like reading off a list, and you have to hear underneath the flatness to get what it cost. She'd had people. A family, not blood only, but the larger kind, the band, the way her people counted family, which is to say more people than a white man means by the word and held closer. They'd been put on a parcel of dry ground east of the mountains, land nobody wanted, which is how her people had got it, and they'd made it do for a while. There'd been an agency that was supposed to send rations. The rations came late, then short, then mostly not at all. A man in a far-off office had decided, she said, that her people were not demonstrating sufficient effort towards self-sufficiency, which was a phrase she repeated to me exact in English, the way you'd repeat a curse in a language you'd learned only the curses of. Sufficient effort towards self-sufficiency. On land that wouldn't grow a weed, with the water rights signed away before they ever got there. The young ones had gone off looking for work, the men to the mines and the railroad, the women to the towns to wash and cook for wages, and most of them hadn't come back, not because they didn't want to, but because the work ate them, or the drink the work drove them to eat them, or the towns ate them in the hundred small ways a town eats a person it has decided not to see. What was left on the parcel by this last hard winter was the old and the young and a handful in the middle holding it together, and Lozan was one of those, and the winter had been long, and the spring had been dry, and by June there were children on that parcel whose ribs you could count, and an old man she called by a word I couldn't repeat who'd stopped eating his share so the children could have it and was dying of it, slow, on purpose, and would not be argued out of it. So she'd walk to Cedar Wash 20-some miles, with the coins they'd scraped together, real coins, earned coins, the last of it, to buy what food a few dollars could buy and carry it back. She'd done it before, twice this spring, at a store 2 towns over that would sell to her if she came at the back and didn't linger. But that store had burned in May. Cedar Wash was the next nearest. She'd never been. She hadn't known. You walked 20 miles, I said. I have walked further. For bread. For them. She looked at the wrapped loaf. There is a boy 6 years. He has not had bread, real bread, from an oven, not the flat we make from the ration meal when there is ration meal. He has not had it since he was small. I wanted to bring him bread. That is a foolish thing. Flour would feed more, I know this. I counted it. And here, for the first time, something cracked in the flat voice, just a hairline, just for a word. But I wanted to bring the boy bread. And I understood her then, the way you understand a thing all at once that you should have seen from the start. She kept accounts too. She was a woman who'd had to weigh every ounce of flour against every mouth for a whole long winter, who knew to the grain what would feed whom and for how long, who had walked 20 miles doing arithmetic the whole way. And she'd let herself, just once, just this one indefensible time, spend a nickel of that careful arithmetic on a thing that didn't add up, a loaf of real bread for one boy who'd never had it, because a person cannot live on arithmetic alone. Because the books we keep, hers and mine and my father's, are not really about the grain or the money. They're about proving we were here and that we did right by what was given us. And sometimes doing right means making the books not balance. Means spending the nickel you can't spare on the bread you don't need so that one boy, one time, knows what it is. I picked the tally book back up. I wrote under the loaf of bread in my father's slanting hand, flour 50 pounds, beans 25 pounds, salt pork, coffee, sugar for the boy. And then I totted it up against the $9 and the list in my breast pocket, and I came up short, well short, and I sat there looking at the numbers that wouldn't balance, and I felt, for the first time in my accounting life, a kind of joy at a column that didn't add up. "What are you doing?" Lozan said. "Trade," I said. "Same as the bread, you'd be doing me a kindness." "No." She sat up straight on the bench, and the dignity came back into her like water back into a wrung cloth, and she said it again, hard. "No, I came to buy. I have money. I am not a—" And she stopped on the edge of the word, and I knew the word the agency man would have used, the word the whole arrangement of the country was built to make her into, and she would not say it about herself, and I loved her a little for not saying it, in the way you can love a stranger for an hour on a hot morning behind a cafe. "All right," I said, "then it's a loan, you'll pay me back." "With what?" "I don't know yet. Same as I don't know what to write in the book." I closed it. "But you strike me as a woman who pays what she owes, and I strike myself as a man who can wait. So it's a loan, and we'll figure the terms later, and right now you're going to sit in the shade and finish that water while I go into Hutchins and buy a wagon's worth of flour and load it on a horse named Patience who is going to hate every mile of it." She looked at me a long time, and then she did the thing I'd been waiting an hour for without knowing it. She smiled, not the soft thing from the porch, but a real one, brief and crooked and tired down to the bone, and she said, "Patience. You named a horse Patience." "My wife's joke, he's got none." "Neither," said Lozen, "do I." And that was the first time she let me hear her laugh, low and rusty, the laugh of a person who'd been a long time without a reason. But I told you this wasn't going to be neat, and here is where the morning came back to collect what it was owed. Because while I'd been behind the cafe learning her name, the front of Cedar Wash had been busy with mine. A town that size doesn't have telegraph wires for its real news, it has porches, and Prout had walked the length of the boardwalk with what he'd seen, and the surveyors had paid their bill and gone, but the story stayed, the way stories do. And by the time I walked back around to the street, it had grown the way stories grow. By the time I pushed open the door of Hutchins' General Store, I was no longer a man who'd bought a loaf of bread. I was a man who'd made Verna Pell serve a squaw at her own counter. That's the word that was traveling, and I'll put it on this page once and never again. But you should know it was the word, because the word is the whole engine of the thing, and now, the porches had it, I was buying out the store to provision a whole camp of them, which would bring more of them, which was how it started. Didn't I know how it started? A town went soft on one, and then Hutchins was behind his counter. He was a careful man, Hutchins, a man who'd kept a store on a one-store street for 20 years by never once having an opinion that might cost him a customer. He had my flour already. I could see it. He'd have heard. He'd have known I'd come, and he had it set back behind the counter, not out where I could reach it, and that told me everything before he opened his mouth. "Tom," he said. "Bill, you know I got no quarrel with you. Then sell me my flour." He didn't move toward it. He spread his hands on the counter flat, the way Lozen had spread hers on the bread, and I understood that I was about to watch a man swear to something, and that it wasn't going to be in my favor. "I got a store to run," Hutchins said. "I got every family in this valley shops here because there's nowhere else. And if it gets around, and it will, Tom, it's already around, that I'm the man who sold the flour that went out to that camp, that's the man I'll be. The flour for the Apache man. You see what I'm telling you? It's not about you. It's not even about her. It's about who shops here Monday." He swallowed. "I can't sell it to you. Not for that. I'm sorry, I am, but I can't." And there it was. The bill come due. I'd thought, in my pride, that the cost of the morning was going to be a few cold looks and Prout not finishing his coffee. I hadn't understood yet. I was only just beginning to understand, standing in that store with my $9 and my list in my breast pocket, and a starving woman in the shade out back depending on me to do the one simple thing I'd promised. That in a town that small, the people who hold the food hold everything, and they had just closed ranks, and they had just made sure that my decency would have nowhere to spend itself. I had $9. I had a horse named Patience. I had a list in my wife's hand with a loop on the G and 2 doors down. I had a woman who'd walked 20 miles for bread and trusted me, against all the evidence of her whole life, just enough to wait on a bench while I went and got the rest. And the only man for 40 miles who had the flour had just told me no. I stood at that counter a long moment. Hutchins wouldn't meet my eye. Out the front window I could see the street had a few more people in it than the heat called for, a town gathering itself quietly to watch how its trouble would end. And I want to tell you, I knew right then what I was going to do. I didn't. I stood there with the whole thing balanced on a knife, and no column in any book I'd ever kept to tell me which way to come down. What broke the knife wasn't a fine idea. It was the list in my breast pocket. I'd had my hand on it without thinking, the way you'll worry a coin or a button, and I felt the fold of it, and I thought of Margaret's handwriting, the loop on the G, a little something sweet if there's money left, you old goat, And a thing came clear to me that I should have seen the second Hutchins spread his hands on his counter. Hutchins wouldn't sell flour to the man who'd served the Apache. Fine. But he'd sell flour to Margaret Aldis, who'd been buying from him for 19 years to feed a ranch with hands to board, and a husband who ate like a horse and 3 nephews who came through at branding. He'd sell flour to a ranch. Flour going to the Aldis place was the most ordinary thing in his ledger. What I did with my own flour on my own land after I'd bought it, well, I'd already made that argument once that morning to Verna over a nickel loaf, and it had worked because it gave the town its coward's loophole, the gap between what you did and what they could say you did. "Bill," I said, "forget the camp. I'm laying in for the season at the ranch. Branding's coming, I'll have my brother's boys, Margaret wants to put up preserves. The usual order plus some. You've sold the Aldis place its summer flour every June since before your boy was born. You going to tell the Porches you wouldn't sell me my own summer flour?" I watched him do the arithmetic, the same arithmetic Verna had done in the cafe doorway. Not is this right, he'd given up on that ledger years ago, but what can be said about me Monday? And the beauty of it, the cold, mean beauty, was that nothing could be said. A rancher buying flour in June was no story at all. There was no porch in Cedar Wash that could make the Aldis place bought flour into anything. The only story was the one connecting my flour to her camp, and I was offering to cut that thread, to take the flour as mine, plain mine, and let what happened to it after happen out past the edge of town where the Porches couldn't see. It was the same trick twice, and I'll be honest with you, I felt the smallness of it even as I worked it. There's no glory in winning a thing by handing your enemy away to pretend he didn't lose. A braver man, a cleaner man, would have made Hutchins say no to her, out loud in front of the street, and let the no be ugly and plain and on the record. But I wasn't trying to fix Cedar Wash, I'd given that up somewhere behind the cafe. I was trying to get 50 pounds of flour and 25 of beans onto a horse and out to a parcel of dry ground where a boy was waiting, and an old man was starving himself on purpose. And you don't feed a starving man with the truth. You feed him with flour. The truth can come later if it comes at all. Hutchins let his breath out. "The usual order," he said, "plus some for the ranch." For the ranch. And I never heard the word camp in my store today. You never did. He sold me the flour. He sold me the beans and the salt pork and the coffee and the sugar. The sugar was the boys. I'd decided sugar costs and I bought it anyway, my own nickel loaf, my own unbalanced column, and he took my $9 and gave me back coins, and he wouldn't meet my eye while he did it. And at the door with my arms full he said low, so the street wouldn't catch it, "It's the right thing you're doing, Tom. I know it is." And I stopped because I thought for a half a second he was going to find his spine. "I just can't afford to be the one doing it," he finished, and went back behind his counter, and that, I have come to think over 40 years, is the truest and saddest sentence anybody said to me that whole day. I know it's right. I just can't afford to be the one doing it. I've heard 100 men say 100 versions of it since. I've said it myself, God help me, about other things other days. It's the sentence that runs the world. It's the sentence the whole arrangement is built on. Loading patience was its own small war, and I won't bore you with it, except to say that a horse named for a virtue he does not possess will tell you in no uncertain terms what he thinks of carrying 50 pounds of flour in July, and that Lozan, watching from the shade, laughed twice more, and that her laughing, rusty, surprised, like something she'd found in a pocket she'd forgotten she had, was worth more to me than the flour, though I'd never have said so. She would not ride, I offered. She'd walk 20 miles in and she'd walk 20 back, she said, and she said it in a way that closed the subject, and I understood it wasn't pride exactly, or it was, but a different pride than I'd have had. It was that the walking was hers. The whole hard thing was hers. She'd carried it in alone and she'd carry it out, and the most I'd be allowed was to walk beside it. So I walked. I led Patience and his flour, and I walked beside Lozan out past the false fronts and the bank and the church that was a schoolhouse, down to where the boardwalk gave up and turned to dirt, and the dirt turned to the wash, and the town fell behind us into its heat shimmer, and nobody stopped us and nobody helped us, and a few faces watched from a few windows, and that was Cedar Wash's whole verdict on the morning: to watch, and not stop us, and not help. Which is the verdict of most places on most things. We walked a long way mostly without talking. The desert in the afternoon doesn't ask for talk. I'll tell you what I remember of it, because the small things are what stayed. The smell of the flour through the sacking, faintly sweet and dusty. The creak of Patience's load. Lozen's shadow and mine, and the horses stretching out longer ahead of us as the day wore down. A hawk working the updraft off a ridge, hung there like it had been nailed to the sky. And her bag with the third of a loaf still in it, the dirty paper, the boy's bread, riding against her hip the whole way like the most precious thing in the train, which it was. About halfway, where the trail bent around a shoulder of rock, she stopped, and I stopped, and she turned to me and she said, "Why?" She'd been carrying the question the whole walk. I could tell. She'd turned it over the way I turn over a column that won't balance. "Why what?" You know why what? She wasn't angry. She wanted the true answer. She was a woman who'd spent the day being lied to and loopholed and pretended around, and she'd come 20 miles with a man who'd done it all on her behalf, and now she wanted, before she let me walk one more mile beside her, to know what I was getting. Because nobody does a thing for nothing. She knew that the way she knew the trail. You bought trouble you can't sell back, your town, your name in your town, for a stranger, so why? And I want to tell you, I gave her some fine answer about justice, about all men being equal, about the words a country says about itself that it doesn't mean. I didn't have those words. I was a rancher with a tally book. What I had was the truth, and I gave her the truth, which was smaller and stranger than any speech. "My father kept that book I showed you," I said, 40 years of columns, and when he died I read the whole thing, every page, looking for him in it, because he wasn't a man who said much, and I thought maybe the book was where he'd kept himself. And it was all grain and stock and rain, 40 years and not one thing in it that couldn't be counted. I had to stop a second. The hawk was still up there. And I thought, that's not a life. That's a record of a life. There's a difference, and he never found it. And I figured I'd end the same. A book full of numbers that balanced, and nothing in it you'd cry over. I shifted Patience's lead from one hand to the other. And then this morning, a woman lowered her own coins like they were worth something after somebody told her they weren't. And I thought, that's the thing that doesn't go in the column. And I'm 51 years old, and I have spent my whole life keeping the wrong book. She looked at me a long time. The shadows had gone blue at the edges. Somewhere a long way off a coyote tried out one note and thought better of it. "That is a selfish reason," she said. "Yes," I said, "it is. I did it for me. I did it so there'd be one page." And she nodded, slow, and something in her settled, and I understood I'd finally given her an answer she could trust. Because a man who tells you he did the right thing for a noble reason is a man who'll want paying in gratitude, in being thought good, and that debt never closes and it poisons everything. But a man who tells you he did it for himself, for one true page in a book of numbers, that man wants nothing from you. That man you can walk beside. She started walking again. After a while she said, not looking at me, "It is a good reason. The selfish ones last. The noble ones people get tired." And we left it there. I'll tell you the end of the day quick, because the end of the day is not really the end of the thing. We came in sight of the parcel near dusk, a low scatter of brush shelters and one tin-roof shack and a cook-fire's thread of smoke, on ground so poor it shamed me to look at it, ground a man would be embarrassed to bury a horse in, and they were living on it, the old and the young and the ones in the middle holding it together. I didn't go in. Lozen made that clear without a word, just a slowing, a way she put herself a half step ahead, and I understood. A white man leading a horse into that camp at dusk was a thing that had, in the history of that camp, never once meant good. My being there would frighten the ones I was trying to feed. So I unloaded the flour onto the ground at the edge, the flour and the beans and the pork and the coffee and the boy's sugar, and Lozen and a younger woman who'd come out carried it in, trip by trip, And the camp gathered at a distance and watched me the way the town had watched me, except that their watching had a different thing under it: fear, and a flicker of something I didn't deserve and couldn't take. The boy came out. I knew him at once, though I'd never seen him 6 years. Ribs you could have counted through the shirt, hanging back behind a woman's leg. And Lozen knelt down and took the third of a loaf out of her bag, the dirty paper, and unwrapped it, and gave it to him. And the boy looked at it. And then he did the thing I have carried 40 years, the thing that is the real end of this story, though I didn't know it yet. He tore it in half and gave half back to her. 6 years old, starved, the first oven bread of his life in his 2 hands, and he tore it in half for the woman who brought it. She took it. She had to. To refuse it would have been to teach him the wrong lesson at the exact moment he was teaching her the right one. So she took her half and she ate it there, kneeling in the dirt, and the boy ate his. And I stood at the edge of the camp by my empty horse with my hat in my hands, and I did not write anything in any book, then or for a long while after, because there are columns the book doesn't have, and I had finally found one, and it was past all counting. I rode home in the dark. I got back near midnight, and Margaret was up, of course she was, with a lamp in the window, and she came out to the yard in her nightdress with her hair down, and she said, "Where in God's name?" And then she saw my face, and she stopped, and she didn't finish. She'd been married to me 19 years. She knew the difference between a man who'd been delayed and a man who'd been changed. I told her all of it at the kitchen table, while the coffee I hadn't bought. I'd given the camp the coffee, went unmade, and we drank water instead. I told her about Verna and the bread and the bench and Lozen's name, and the boy and Hutchins saying, "I just can't afford to be the one doing it." I told her the town would make us pay, that it already was, that there'd be cold shoulders at church and maybe worse, that Prout would talk and Doyle might come around asking questions, that we might not be welcome at the places we'd always been welcome. And Margaret listened the whole way through, and when I was done she got up and she got the list out of my breast pocket where I'd left it folded all day, and she smoothed it on the table, her own handwriting, the coffee and the flour and the thread and the liniment and the nails and a little something sweet if there's money left, you old goat. And she looked at the list of the day I was supposed to have had, and then she looked at me and she said, "You didn't get the thread." And I started to laugh or to cry. I genuinely to this day don't know which it started as, and she came around the table and put my head against her and held it, and she said into my hair, fierce, low, the truest thing said to me on a day full of true things. "Good. I'm glad you didn't get the thread. Lozen paid the loan. I want you to know that because she'd want you to know it, because she was a woman who paid what she owed. She came back in the fall, walking the boy with her this time, and she brought me a thing. I won't tell you what, it's mine, and she said it was the terms we'd settle on. And I tried to say there were no terms, and she gave me the look that closed subjects, and so I took it, and it sits where I can see it from this chair, and it has sat there 40 years. The town did make us pay for a while in the small mean ways towns have, and then it mostly forgot, the way towns do, which is its own kind of mercy and its own kind of crime. Verna Pell, I'll tell you, served the next one. There was a next one, a young man 2 years on, and she served him at the back fast, not kindly but not refusing, and I have always believed, though she'd have called me a liar to my face, that some splinter of that hot morning had worked its way in and wouldn't come out. You don't change a town all at once. You change it by giving it a way to do the right thing while pretending it did the usual thing, and then you wait, and you don't get to see most of the result, and that has to be enough. I kept the tally book. I keep it still. But I started a second one that night at the kitchen table after Margaret went up, a book with no columns, blank pages, where I write the things that can't be counted, and the first thing in it, in my father's slanting hand that I never could shake, is the only line I had for the day. A boy tore his bread in half. That's all. I didn't explain it. Some things you write down so you won't lose them, not so you'll understand them. And 40 years on I have not lost it, and I do not understand it, and I have stopped trying, the way you stop trying to understand why the one star comes out before the others. It just does. He just did. He was 6 and he was starving, and he tore his bread in half and gave the half back. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to be a man who would do the same and mostly failing, and once in a while, once in a great while. Well, the lamp's low. Margaret's been gone 11 years now, and I still keep her side of the bed made. The thing Lozen gave me catches the last of the light from where it sits. And if you've sat with me this long, through the whole of it, then you'll know already the one thing I most want you to take when you go, so I won't insult you by saying it plain. I'll just say, get the thread if you can, but there are mornings you'll be glad you didn't.